Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph McKenna from the National Centre for Writing here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. It's June 2023 and today's episode is all about writing historical fiction. It's also got the bonus of featuring two extraordinary women from right here in Norwich and Norfolk. A few weeks ago, we were fortunate to host a packed-out event with writers Victoria Mackenzie and Sally-Anne Lomas, who brought to life the stories and legacies of two of Norfolk's most famous women, Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. NCW's Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement, Holly Ainley, caught up with Victoria after the event to discuss her debut novel, For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain, the joys and pitfalls of researching historical periods, and how you communicate this to contemporary readers. This insightful discussion also covers the blurry lines between fact and fiction, the moral responsibility of authors when writing about real historical figures, and what term historical fiction actually encompasses, how it's used by the publishing industry, and what it really means to authors. It's especially fascinating to hear Victoria explore the language of historical fiction and the challenge of writing about other writers, how their language and style became part of the way she chose to tell their stories. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Holly in conversation with Victoria Mackenzie.
Victoria Mackenzie, Vicky, welcome to the Writing Life podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. Thank you. So you are both a poet and a novelist, and I might say historical novelist for the purposes of today's conversation, because the subject we're here to get into today is historical fiction. Like all subgenres of general fiction, historical is this really rich and varied area that encompasses all kinds of styles of writing. And of course, it also intersects with other genres. So we've got historical crime fiction, historical romance, and then we've got sort of his commercial fiction that's set in historical times. And perhaps where your work sits, historical literary fiction. Now, I realise that's a lot of names and terms to start with, so I thought that's actually a good place for us to start with the term. And it's one of those labels that we see, historical fiction, when we go into a bookshop or we search online, on an online bookshop. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on, we know this is something that publishers have imposed, really, but is that just to make fiction more commercially palatable, or is it actually a useful term for readers? What does it do, that term?
I think it can be useful for readers, but as you've suggested, it's such a broad genre with all of these extra genres in, like romance and crime and so on, that it is a bit of a funny one. And I suppose readers will have particular tastes within that. And I also feel that perhaps, you mentioned that maybe I fall under literary historical fiction, that I'd say pre-Hilary Mantel, I might just have been called literary fiction. As she talks in her Wreath lectures, which she did for the BBC in 2017, about how before she was writing her Tudor novels, if a literary novelist wrote a historical, so she gives the examples of Robert Graves writing I, Claudius, for example. But there's loads of other examples, like John Banville wrote Dr. Copernicus. These weren't labelled as historical fiction, I don't think. They were just fiction or literary fiction. And in a way, I feel like Mantel opened the floodgates, and she made writing historical fiction something that was almost more respectable, something that writers didn't then mind having the label. So I feel if you'd asked people before then, what's historical fiction, I think I'd have said Jean Plaidy, the kind of like the series, lots and lots of novels about historical figures that weren't necessarily that accurate, that probably now would say was under the romance category. So I feel, I'm not sure as a writer whether I find labels helpful. I'm pretty sure I don't. And I didn't intend to be a historical novelist. It's something that's just happened because of my interests going in particular directions. And I don't think that I'll necessarily always write historical fiction either. So it is a marketing tool, and probably writers don't really think about it. But I think for readers, it can be helpful for navigating their way towards what they want to read, given how many thousands of books are published every year.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair summary, but really interesting what you say about Hilary Mantel there and the kind of change in the term. But I mean, you sort of touched on there that you don't feel that you have to kind of continue writing historical fiction forever. But I wonder whether the term or any of these kinds of terms do pigeonhole some authors, whether it's limiting sometimes.
I suppose some authors might feel that way, especially if they've had like a very big success with a book. And then I can imagine that their editors would be very keen to replicate that success with something similar. You know, there's that sense of building on the readership, giving those readers, something similar that they'd enjoy just as much. But to be honest, I'm not sure. I feel that writing a book is something so personal and is such an enormous effort that most writers are going to, a lot of writers are just going to write what it is they're most excited to write next. I hope that's true anyway. And so won't necessarily worry too much. I mean, I guess in commercial fiction, there's that sense of building a brand and so on. But for me, I feel like my first novel's such a strange one that I don't really know how I can build a brand based on for like great pain. I don't think I've got any more small quirky novels about medieval mystics in me. I think that was a one-off. So I'll just be following my heart for whatever comes next.
That's good. Although, who knows? Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be doing a podcast on medieval mystic fiction.
It's a whole new genre, yeah.
And it was Victoria Mackenzie who changed the landscape.
I love that, yeah.
So historical fiction, I think, as we're already alluding to here, is an incredibly popular genre. And I think there's also a lot of historical fiction that gets adapted for screen. I'm thinking really recently of Bernard Cornwell's The Last Kingdom series, of Poldark even, and of course Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, there was an amazing BBC adaptation of. And why do we think it's such a popular genre? What makes it so enticing?
I think that what's interesting about historical fiction is you've got this wonderful frisson between looking at the ways that people are different from us now. So, their sort of day-to-day lives, how they dress, how they, get around the country, what their ideologies are and so on. But then there's also an enjoyment in thinking about all the ways that we're still similar to them. So I think that's, that's something that's quite fun. You're looking at like the machinations of the Tudor court and thinking, okay, well, it's a completely different world. We're not concerned with, launching the Reformation right now, whatever. But at the same time, it's about things that we still are very interested in and that are still playing out in politics now, to do with, who has the ear of the powerful, who gets things done, who's actually, shaping the direction the country's going in. Those are all completely relevant to contemporary society. So I think it's that kind of fuzzy space in the middle about how we like them and how we not like them that makes historical so much fun to play around with.
Yeah, something about sort of comparing our identities,
past
and present. Yeah, I agree. And just keeping it quite broad at the moment, I'm particularly as I get older interested to know what makes historical fiction, because we're talking here about medieval times, Tudor times, but actually to somebody born in the last 20 years, are the 1990s, is that historical fiction?
Yeah, someone born in 1980, that thought's horrible. But perhaps if I was 17 years old right now, perhaps I'd, be thinking that the 1990s was the past. And certainly because of the rate of change of technology, there are plenty of things about the 1990s that would have to be explained by a novelist, in terms of like going around with your CD Walkman, or, telephones that you have to put your finger in and move a dial around. These things have to be explained to today's teenagers. We can't take those for granted. I just read Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, which is set in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. So I was thinking, is that historical fiction? Personally, because it's so close to when I was actually alive, and I don't think of myself as old, it's not historical fiction. But I guess the boundaries are always shifting. I mean, I've read some definitions of historical that it's, fiction written more than 50 years after the events occurred. But I'm aware that the 1970s is starting to creep into that territory, which just feels really strange to me. I also find it weird to think that historical could be something an author writes from memory rather than research. So like Elizabeth Jane Howard's Cazalet series, draws on sort of 1950s. And I imagine that she was drawing on a lot of personal memory for that. So that seems strange to think of that as historical as well. I suppose it's a bit of a fuzzy boundary, and different people have different ideas about it.
Yeah, and I suppose that speaks to what we were saying at the top there about how varied and how rich it is as a genre. Perhaps as well, there's a little bit of publishers getting to decide what's historical and what's not.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah. Okay, well, so let's focus in on your work now. You've already mentioned that it wasn't historical fiction per se that was the driving force between you choosing the particular narrative you did. I'm guessing it was the subjects and the story. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and also how you came to this historical narrative?
Yeah, sure. So For Thy Great Pain is basically set in 1413, and it's the stories of two medieval women who really lived, Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. And they tell their stories to the reader in first person in interweaving monologues. So the book does dip back in time as they recall their childhoods and so on. What drew me to it, as I said, I didn't consciously think, right, I want to be a historical novelist. What period would be fun to write about? What I actually thought was, I want to write a novel about Julian of Norwich because she was an anchoress, and the idea of being an anchoress just fascinates me so much. So she lived in a single room attached to the Church of St Julian in Norwich, probably for around 30 years in the second part of her life. And she couldn't leave on pain of excommunication. She had to dedicate her life to prayer and contemplation in a single room. And I just found that such an extraordinary life choice, and that seemed so counter to what most of us aspire to for our own lives in terms of, freedom to see the world, freedom to have a family and have a home life, to, go out and see our friends. And, I think we really value exposing ourselves to as much of the world, as much life as possible. So the idea of actively choosing to restrict your life to a single room as an imaginative act really, really drew me. And that's basically why I wanted to write the novel, this anchoress experience. I thought that the challenge of setting a novel in a single room would be a really interesting challenge for a writer as well. And once I started to research Julian of Norwich's life, I very quickly came across the figure of Marjorie Kemp, who I hadn't heard of before, and discovered that Marjorie, like Julian, had visions of Christ. She was a mystic. She lived in Norfolk, 30 or 40 miles to the north in Bishop's Lynn, which is now King's Lynn. But rather than being an anchoress, she was the mother of 14 children, a merchant's wife, and very much part of her community, working as an alewife and so on. So she had such a different experience from Julian, even whilst they had so much in common. And I think that kind of parallelism as a writer was really appealing. And I read both their books, Julian's Revelations of Divine Love, Marjorie's The Book of Marjorie Kemp, and these incredibly different personalities came through. And so one of the large joys as a writer was setting these two voices together. So yeah, it was really very much, first of all, this anchoress experience, and then discovering this incredible figure of Marjorie Kemp that spurred me to write this novel.
Really interesting that you came at it through character, but actually, the time period, and as we've talked about, the sort of circumstances in which these characters lived, that historical setting is so central to their story and to what shaped their character. So I wonder, once you started exploring them and getting to know them, whether you then felt that the time period had a particular appeal. Actually,
it really did. So I'd never studied the medieval period before, so I got myself lots of books of social history and books about the lives of women in the medieval period, the lives of anchoresses in the medieval period, and started to learn. And I really fell in love with this period. What surprised me was how, despite the 600-year gap, how immediate it felt to me. It really felt like a very tangible time. I could really feel myself living in Norfolk at this time. I think one of the things that's really important for almost all historical writers is thinking about how do you convey that time period. And I think one of the best ways of doing it is through the tangible, through the sensory details. So I really enjoyed researching things like what they would have eaten, the sorts of sounds that their world was filled with. So, in the medieval period, really the loudest sound they would have heard would have been the bells ringing out the hours of the day. But apart from that, it wasn't a particularly noisy world. You have to remember, it's like, pre-industry. Wouldn't have been that much traffic. People weren't even going around in carriages, horse-drawn carriages or anything like that. Mostly people travelled on foot or horseback. So it was a much quieter world than ours, which I suppose appealed to me. I live in the country. I'm not a city girl. But yeah, and then thinking about like the textures of the clothes they wore, what their furniture was like, things like this. I just found it a world that I felt I could step into and give the readers just these small details to make it feel very tactile, very real. So that's one of the sort of key ways that I try to recreate that sense of the medieval world.
Oh, it's so interesting, that idea of kind of finding the tangible as your route. I think we should stay on research. I think our listeners would be really interested to hear more about the research process. I mean, you talked about getting at lots of books about the how it living as an anchoress and about the period, but I mean, where do you start? Was that you just went to the library and just did a Google search, or?
Yes, Google is very much the historical novelist's friend. I was actually writing this book in 2020 during lockdown, so there were certain avenues of research that just weren't available to me. So I didn't travel, I didn't go to Norfolk, so I didn't go to Julian's cell or to Lynn, and I couldn't go into archives either. I couldn't go to the British Library and look at manuscripts or anything. So I was restricted in that way. But yeah, I mean, I suppose research doesn't scare me because I have a PhD. So I've already been scared. I've been through that terror. So I'm quite good at sort of quickly filleting which books are going to be relevant, which books look interesting. And so basically, and there's so much online as well, like there's amazing websites like medieval.net, and you can basically put questions in, and you'll get these wonderful so useful short articles on things to do with medieval dress or medieval food or medieval periods. That was the kind of thing that I really, found so fascinating. You just think
the gory details.
Yeah, and like the kind of the stuff that is real day-to-day living. How did a woman cope with a period in 1413? How interesting. So I learned all about that, and I put some details in for Marjorie as she grows up and has to encounter becoming a woman. So I find all that small stuff that that people really lived every day. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I guess it's, you say small stuff, but actually it's the stuff exactly as you're saying, that readers, that us normal average people who weren't kings or knights of the realm or whatever can actually relate to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things that I think helps make the characters feel more immediate and to bridge that 600-year gap between them and us. It's one of the things that we feel that we have in common. We all still have to cope with our bodily functions.
Indeed. And so you've got all this research, and you've got all this new knowledge, but then how do you ensure that you don't then overwhelm the reader? How is it that you know what to put in, what to leave out? I mean, there's that sort of that idea of the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah.
Just saying enough.
And I think you're making like a million tiny decisions about that with every sentence, thinking, what do I give the reader here, and what's not relevant and what's not really contributing to the story, but I just, I find so fascinating. It's really hard. I think what helped me was that before I wrote For Thy Great Pain, I'd been spending 5 years working on another novel called Brantwood about the Victorian art critic John Ruskin. And it's so different as a process because Ruskin wrote over 200 books and pamphlets himself. Plus there are dozens and dozens of biographies and books about him, academic works about him, so much secondary material. There's letters and diaries that are available. The mountain of material to do with Ruskin is absolutely epic. It's Everest. Whereas with For Thy Great Pain, it was much more of a small bump because we know almost nothing about Julian's life, for example. We don't even know her real name. So there was, I could do reading about her revelations. I could, read about sort of theological interpretations of her writing, and I could read about women and anchoresses more generally, but there just wasn't that vast amount of material to cope with. And the same with Marjorie Kemp. There's a bit more autobiography in her own book, and so I could use that as a framework. So I know she had 14 children and so on. We know more about her than we do about Julian, but it was a much more manageable amount of research to cope with. And I think because I really struggled with my Ruskin novel with those questions that you're asking about, how do you know what to put in, how do you know what to give the reader, how do you know what to keep back? And I feel I was trying to give the reader too much with Ruskin, trying to share too much of my research to the detriment of story, essentially. So with For Thy Great Pain, I tried to put story and character and voice to the forefront and only use my research in ways that I felt were basically giving some nice texture to the story, and in ways that I tried to make quite unobtrusive. So, for example, thinking about the things that they ate. At one point, I described Marjorie as having a blister the size of a gooseberry, and then I had to research whether or not they had gooseberries in medieval England. So, little things like this, my research was informing, but I was very conscious, as I say, of putting sort of character and voice and story to the forefront of that book.
So would you say that makes it less intimidating? I mean, are you finding the Ruskin book, which I think you're writing now, is it intimidating to be faced with that much historical information about a person?
I think, yes, I was intimidated when I wrote the first incarnation of it, but I feel less intimidated now because I am trying not to think too much about what Ruskin scholars or people who are very knowledgeable about Ruskin will think of the novel. I'm trying to do basically what I did with For Like Grey Pain, which is write a book that I want to read that gives me enormous pleasure as a reader. And so I'm trying to write the Ruskin book as the book about Ruskin that I would want to read, especially if I was coming to Ruskin without, a great deal of background knowledge. That's really who my ideal reader is, someone who's heard of him, might know a few things about him, but isn't a Ruskin expert. Because I think if you write with the expert in mind, as you say, it is intimidating, and you worry about getting every single thing right. And with Ruskin, it is a novel I am imagining. So if I put him in a certain location on a certain day, because that's what the story needs, I'm very comfortable with that. But I'm aware that there'll be an expert somewhere who will, find the diary or the letter that proves that he wasn't there on that day. And that's really got to be something that I'm not worrying about anymore. I'm writing something that I want to succeed as a novel, as a work of art, basically, rather than as something that has every single detail about Ruskin right to the letter.
Yeah, and it's historical fiction after all, isn't it? It sounds like you have to kind of almost come through the research process and then move forward from it and find those spaces in between, perhaps, that you can occupy as a novelist.
Yeah, absolutely. And just find the nuggets of research that stimulate my imagination and that will bring Ruskin to life as a character on the page, rather than thinking, about the kind of scholarly background to him.
Yeah. And so I mean, I'm sort of getting a sense of what you've learned from the process of writing two quite different stories, but both what we'd call historical fiction. And we're talking a lot about character here and the challenge of writing real historical characters. Are there any other sort of challenges to that, knowing that a person really existed? Because a lot of historical fiction isn't based on real historical characters. It's completely imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important as a writer to ask yourself why you're writing about someone who really lived. And I think it's, worth thinking about the sort of ethical questions around that. Because, I just feel that sometimes readers do understand the contract that it is fiction, but there are ways in which something that's fiction can really influence the way a person's regarded, their reputation, for example. So with Ruskin, he really fell out of fashion in the 20th century and has been represented in popular culture in ways that are, I think, quite unfair to who he was as a person. So one of the motivations for me writing on Ruskin was to emphasize the things that I think are interesting about him as a real person. I wouldn't go as far to say that it's a sort of rehabilitation of Ruskin. He is a very complicated and flawed character. He's not always likable. He's not always relatable. But I think such a complicated character makes a really interesting study for a novel, and that novels can do things with characters that other sort of biographies or so on can't do, because I am able to imagine his thought processes. I can imagine his conversations with friends and loved ones and bring out that side of him, and be quite empathetic towards him, even if I'm disagreeing with some of the things that he thinks, for example. Some of his views are quite unpalatable to contemporary readers. So I feel that fiction it's both, as I say, it's both made up and fictionalized, and you can do what you want. But I also think you have a certain responsibility to that person if they were a real if they really lived. I would hate to think, you just think of yourself, imagine in 150 years someone writing a novel about you and completely misrepresenting you. That's I don't know, I'm waffling a bit now, but
no, I think that's such an interesting point about the ethics of being a historical novelist. And I guess it becomes even more so when there are people still around who might have known the character in question, or the character themselves might still be alive in some cases. And so would you ever write about a real character who is a bit more in our recent history?
I can't imagine it. I'm not going to say no, never, because I know I can't predict my own imagination. But I think I would find it inhibiting to write about someone either who was still alive, in which case there's loads of libel issues for one thing, or who had died not that long ago, or who had living descendants or people, who would be around wanting to defend their reputation, for example. So I think just imaginatively, I wouldn't feel like I had free rein, and I think that would stop me from really getting deep into some kind of imaginative project about a person. So I think, with Marjorie and Julian, the enormous time distance was very helpful for that. I didn't feel I had relatives to answer to, and I was conscious that I was essentially trying to represent both of them in a way that I felt was fair and empathetic. And then with Ruskin, he doesn't have any living descendants, certainly not close descendants, because he didn't have any children himself. And I feel that I'm on his side more than other writers or filmmakers or so on have been. So I feel that lets me free imaginatively as well to feel that I'm doing something that is that's on his side, that's being kind to him, and that's part of my motivation for why I want to write about him.
It's really, I'm just reflecting back on what you said about how a historical fiction might actually influence somebody's reputation. Because thinking that if you'd never read, going back to Hilary Mantel again, if you'd never read anything about the Tudors, and that was what you'd have a pretty good sense of them because it was Hilary Mantel and she was, brilliant. But you can kind of really influence somebody's perception of not just of the character, but of a whole time period, if you get details wrong.
Completely. And I mean, her book is quite empathetic to Thomas Cromwell. And I studied 16th century history at school, and the way that I learned it was, to massively simplify, Cromwell was the baddie and Thomas More was the goodie.
Right.
And I watched A Man for All Seasons with Paul Schofield as Thomas More. And when Thomas More is put to death because he refuses to recognise Henry as head of the church, I cry buckets, absolutely buckets. But then when you read or watch Wolf Hall, it's a very cold portrayal of More, very cold. And it's funny because my husband is Scottish and he hasn't studied English Tudor history at school. So actually, Wolf Hall is the first time that he's really learnt about these people. So we have these stupid mock arguments where I'm defending Thomas More and he's defending Thomas Cromwell because we both have opposite views of them. It's a lot to do with fictional representation. It's to do with A Man for All Seasons and Wolf Hall.
but there we go. It absolutely shows, doesn't it, that the responsibility of a historical novelist. So I want to come on to thinking a little bit about style now and language in historical fiction, particularly in For Thy Great Pain, how you might have used language to signify the period, in more subtler ways.
Yeah, so I I've written it in a kind of prose style that's a little bit odd. Just the grammar and the syntax is a little bit strange. And with both voices, I really drew on the texts of the women themselves in terms of thinking about how to create that on the page. So Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich is such a calm, contemplative book. It's very metaphorical. It's very full of sort of calm detail and close observation. So when I was creating Julian's voice, I really leaned into that and thought about how she would be a great observer of the natural world, for example, and included a lot of detail like that in my novel. With Marjorie, she has a much more chaotic voice. Marjorie's autobiography is it was dictated to a scribe rather than written. So in some ways it's unfair to criticise because she didn't have the opportunity to read over and redraft or structure it or anything. But it wanders all over the place in terms of chronology. She repeats herself. She's not a great observer of the natural world. It's very much a book that's focused on her feelings, what she saw, her relations with her neighbours and community, her husband, and talking about her visions. But a lot of it is to do with her interactions with clergy and other figures of authority, and how they're always hounding her and trying to have her arrested. So I really enjoyed the contrast of the two voices of the two women, and sort of took my lead from those in terms of creating the style of the voices. And there's no narrative in my novel. It's just the two women telling their stories to the reader. So it's each of their voices is absolutely key to how the novel comes across. And in terms of that, I think that was really helpful in terms of thinking about how to avoid modern turns of phrase, because I was, trying to inhabit these women and their worldviews, really trying to be in their bodies. So I think that helped in terms of not accidentally using quite modern phrasing. And I tried to keep my vocabulary obviously very much to things that they would know about.
Yes, we talked about the gooseberry, the blister the size of the gooseberry and whether gooseberries existed.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it probably made my life easier in a way, not having a narrator, not having that kind of omniscient third person present in the novel, but just having these two women talking and telling their stories.
And your background is writing poetry, and I think the book's been sort of praised for its rhythm and for its often sort of poetic feel. Do you think that was something that came very naturally to you, or do you think you also took that from probably the writings of Julian? I'm thinking of more than Marjorie.
There's not so much poetry to Marjorie. I think it was a combination of both. I imagine that what drew me to Julian's writing was the fact that, as you say, I'd written poetry for a long time. My PhD was studying poetry, and then Julian is a fantastic literary stylist, not just a great theologian. So, her writing is very rhythmical, which is something I try to imitate. She uses a lot of metaphor and very vivid, precise imagery. So, for example, at one point in her visions, she sees a kind of devilish figure approaching her, and she describes him as having red skin, but she says it's red, the colour of newly fired roof tiles. It's very good details. She's got a poet's eye there. So even 600 years later, we can very clearly see that terracotta red of this devilish figure's skin. So I feel like it's those really, good close observations that make Julian's work, you feel like it's got that kind of density of poetry. But then I took it further in some ways as well. So I did experiment with using line breaks and shaping the text on the page so that your lines sort of cascade down, for example. Or when Julian is in her anchoress cell and she's really feeling very claustrophobic, I repeat the phrase stone walls many times so that they form almost like bricks that run across the page and like block the page. There's these two lines, it's just stone walls, stone walls, stone walls, stone walls. So I really enjoyed using sort of basically poetic techniques like that to use the form and the appearance of words on the page to add to the meaning.
Yeah, and it's so effective as a reading experience as well. What we haven't touched on, and I think perhaps we ought to, is the very kind of in-your-face fact that this is a novel about two deeply religious women living in a deeply religious society, and oftentimes historical fiction is writing about a time when there's no getting away from it. It was so different to now in that everybody had religion, so spirituality you can't get away from. And I just wonder how you felt about kind of putting yourself into that world and that society. I don't know if you have your faith today, but even if you do, it would be presumably very different to the way that it was kind of felt on a day-to-day basis back then.
Yeah, it's funny. It just felt very intuitive to me, and I didn't give the religious aspect an enormous amount of conscious thought. And now that the book's out, it's something I'm asked about so much more than I ever expected. It's been really fascinating, and I've had a lot of people assume that I am religious when I don't come from a position of religious faith. And so that's been quite a strange experience. And just on Friday, I did a reading at the Jesuit Centre in London. So, there's been an enormous response from the religious community, and it's been a really positive response as well, which I'm really, so pleased about. It's funny, yeah. So I'm not religious at all. I do think most people have a spiritual aspect to their inner lives. My first degree was philosophy and English, and I've always been interested in the big questions, and I just assume most people are. Why are we here? How should we live? What makes for a good life? And I think I was just channeling that aspect of my inner life, essentially, when I was thinking about what mattered to these women and thinking about their religious faith. And it was, of course, conscious to write about religious subjects. These women's visions are absolutely essential to who they are. And as you say, in the medieval period, there's simply no getting away from religion. There were, a small number of proto-Reformation types, but generally religion wasn't something that was particularly questioned. It was just part of day-to-day life. So it was important to me to embrace that, just as I embraced, the muddy roads and eating of hot peas cods. For me, it was sort of, that was all part and parcel of it. I don't know yet. I mean, I'm drawn to books about religious topics, I suppose, which I can't really explain given that I don't have faith. As a teenager, I loved novels about nuns, absolutely. And I think that's what drew me to the anchoress experience. I love thinking about people who make these really extreme decisions for their life and who devote themselves to something to, such an astonishing extent that it impacts all other aspects of their life. And I suspect that why I'm drawn to Ruskin is for a similar reason, actually. Not, that he is incredibly religious, but he's such an idealist. He has these very strong ideas about what makes for a good life, and he's very critical of Victorian industrial capitalism, for example. And he makes a lot of enemies along the way. So I think, people who believe things very strongly, I'm really drawn to.
That's fascinating. Well, we're coming to the close of our conversation, but I don't want to end without... We've been talking quite a lot about examples of historical fiction in this conversation, but do you have a favourite or some favourite historical novels?
Yes, this is a very easy question for me. So I love historical fiction. I'm not going to talk about Mantell because it's just too obvious. So I thought I'd mention a few novels that, people do read but aren't as well known as Mantell. So my first example would be Bark Skins by Annie Proulx, which is a great big tome. It came out at a similar time to The Overstory by Richard Powers, and it's very similar in that it's all about trees. A bark skin is a woodcutter, and it's a huge epic novel. It begins 17th century with French migrants coming over to the eastern seaboard of America and essentially beginning to cut down America and Canada's trees. And it spans centuries. It comes pretty much up to the present day. And I think Annie Proulx is an incredibly ambitious and interesting writer. It's one of those novels that, jumps between characters and through time. And I think that can be very difficult when you get invested in a particular story and then you lurch forward, 50 years later. But every single story within that novel is fascinating. So I think Bark Skins is definitely up there.
That's a great recommendation, and the feat of historical research which must have gone into that in order to span so many periods and centuries.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I researched roughly the early 15th century, but Annie Proulx basically researched like 300 or 400 years a novel, so it's a really tremendous feat. My other novel is quite different. It's a very slim novel by the Scottish novelist who's no longer with us, Ian Crichton Smith, and it's called Consider the Lilies. And it's an exquisite slim novel about an old woman who is evicted from her home during the Highland clearances. So we're talking sort of late 18th, early 19th century. And so it's it's a real microcosm. It focuses right down on one old woman's plight rather than the Annie Proulx, which is sort of hundreds of years worth of eastern seaboard history. This is so moving, and it's one of the things I think that historical fiction can do really well, of taking a big event like the Highland clearances when people were evicted from the land so that landowners could put sheep, which were more profitable. And so many Scots were forced to migrate to Canada and America or to Australia. They were just burnt out of their houses. And it takes a big event like the clearances and just focuses on the impact on one, elderly, forgettable old woman that history doesn't remember, and shows the sort of impact on her personally. It's remarkable. It's so beautiful. It's so sad. Yeah, I think everybody should read Consider the Lilies.
Oh gosh, well, I know what I'm doing straight after we've finished our conversation. Thank you. Oh, Vicky, thank you so much for those two recommendations. We'll have to make sure that we put those names in the text that goes with the podcast as well. But thank you as well. Thank you for talking to us both about your book and about this beast that is historical fiction.
That's my pleasure. It's been lovely to chat with you.
A big thank you to Victoria and Holly. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you pick up a copy of For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain. It really is something special, and Victoria's event with Sally at Dragon Hall was one of the most popular we've had in recent years. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Writers Centre. We're on Facebook, and you can find out more about the podcast, our programmes, and subscribe to our newsletter over on the website nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation to us today over on the website by going to the Support Us page. Please do subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review because it helps other people to find us. Thanks again, keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.